Surely.
Who's going to be speaking next? Is it
Do
you?
you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear a voice. Yeah. Is that Galahindi?
Kalahindi. Yeah, so I'm just going to pass the headset over to Dan.
Sounds good.
So what I'll do is I'll come over, Meredith, do I come over closer to me? I'll get right over next to Mark here.
He loves it when I chase him.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you.
Great.
Yeah, I got you, Dave.
Great. Somebody was wondering if Mary Lou and Dan could explain the 4 traditional medicines to us a bit.
Okay. Mary Lou, did you hear that question?
Yes, I did. We call them the sacred medicines. We use sweetgrass, cedar, sage, and tobacco. We use those in our ceremonies. We use the tobacco to ask for permission. There's a sacred fire right here in front of me. And when a sacred fire is going to be lit, you have to put tobacco down on the ground first before you put any wood or anything there. So you have to have that sacred fire with your good intentions and ask the sky world for permission to light that fire. So we are permission seeking people. And we also use tobacco to communicate with the sky world. We put tobacco in our pipes. We create smoke by puffing on the pipe, but we never inhale that smoke. And so we use that smoke to send the prayers up to the sky world. And also if we need to speak to an elder, or if we need certain ceremonies, we will give tobacco ties. That's a piece of cloth with tobacco inside it, and it's wrapped up and tied up with a ribbon or a string or something like that. So we also use sage in our smudge, and we use sweetgrass. When I was a young woman, sweetgrass was often used, and women on their moon time could not smudge when it was their time. And often when a ceremony was happening, the woman would have to leave if she was on her moon time. So as I grew more knowledgeable, Dan and I discovered that sage is women's medicine, and sage can be used when a woman is on her time. So after we discovered that, we started using sage all the time. So we would not have to ask women to leave. We don't want to center anybody out or make them stand in the corner behind us or something, you know, sit in a circle behind us. So we use that sage, and we also use cedar. Cedar has many multiple purposes and uses. So, you know, you can, there's all kinds that anybody could find out about. Anybody contributing here?
Okay, I would just add that with the medicine cedar, Mary Lou was mentioning earlier about how the cedar tea was treated for the scurvy. It was treated to the explorers or invaders, and cedar tea has, I don't know how many, it's as much as maple sap, natural organic chemical elements that are good for people, with a great amount of vitamin C.
This has the greatest amount of vitamin C that you can get anywhere. You cannot go into a store and purchase that much vitamin C. So you can go in your backyard, offer your tobacco, and pick some cedar and make yourself some tea, and you will be healthy. So cedar is very versatile. We use it in our ceremonies. We use it in our sweat lodges. We use it when we're fasting. We make a circle around our lodge that protects us. And as Dan was saying about using the cedar to make tea, when our pipes need to be clean, I will make a pot of cedar tea, and we'll have some. And then when it cools down, I'll use another pot, and I'll pour some cedar tea in there, and I'll put our pipe bowls in there and just let them sit and then it just cleans itself. I don't have to scrub it or anything. Just cleans off all the residue that's from the tobacco. And then with the rest of the cedar that's left over, I put it in my floor pail, and I wash the floor because I have instant pine salt. So all things, everything that is on earth is very versatile. And just like our songs, like I was talking about a little earlier about the rock song and the eagle song, well, there's another song that's very versatile too. We learned it up here in Canada. It was called the Strong Woman's Song, and it was given to the women in prison. Maggie Hall gave it to the women so they would have strength and courage while they served their time. And one time, Dan and I were down in San Francisco working at this halfway house in San Francisco. And so I ended up working with the women, and Dan was working with the men, and they were all indigenous from the area of California. So every time we started a session, we always had a song, a smudge, and a prayer. So I sang the Strong Woman song, and then one woman who was in our circle said to me, I come from Northern California. Where I come from, we call that the owl song. And then she come over and stood beside me, and then she grabbed my hands like we were kind of crisscross, and she was showing me how they dance. And then another time, Dan and I were in Toronto at a concert that was being put on at Harbourfront by Gary Farmer. What was that called?
I think it was just the Aboriginal Voices Music Festival.
Yeah, Gary Farmer put it on. So Dan was interviewing this man by the name of Quiltman.
John Trudeau and Quiltman.
Yeah, he was talking to Quiltman at the time. And there was a group called Asayenes, a women's group from Edmonton, who were warming up. They were going to be playing on the stage. So they were singing the Strong Woman song. And this man, Quiltman, who came from Oregon, he stopped and he said to Dan, he said, "You're singing the owl song," So that song down in California and Oregon, out that way, that represents the owl and has teachings. And up here, it represents helping the women. So everything that we have, we have multiple uses for it.
Yes, I'd just like to say that for the Strong Woman song, we were first introduced to it by Lionel Whitebird and what's his partner's name?
Wanda Whitebird.
Wanda Whitebird, yes. And they brought it down from Kingston because they both worked with the institutions in Kingston, Collins Bay, Joyceville, but Wanda worked in the prison for women, P4W. So what Lionel went in to teach the women, because the women had their own big drum. And so he taught them that song, the Strong Woman song. And he said that Maggie Paul, they were already singing it before Lionel got there. And so like he helped them to learn that song and to sing it, and so that it was very, very powerful. It became good, powerful medicine for them. So then they brought it down to our lodge when we were praying in just north of Guelph, on the Ignatius farm community there. And so we were introduced to this Strong Woman song, not having had heard anything about the owl song, the history. Yeah, we never heard about the owl song. So we're listening to this song and we're singing it. Mary Lou's getting great healing from it because you were singing it everywhere whenever you were.
It helped me quit smoking. Because when I was feeling withdrawal and I was walking home from the store feeling really not very nice, I would start humming the Strong Woman song. I'd get to the grocery store, I'd be kind of la-la-la-ing it, and then I'd be singing it very softly, and by the time I got home, I'd be singing it at the top of my lungs, and I didn't feel awful, going through withdrawal, so that really helped me.
Yeah, and so I had met this fellow by the name of John Trudeau many years ago, probably about 1974, at the apartment of Harry Belafonte in Manhattan, right in New York City. And the leadership of the American Indian movement were strategizing. And at that time, there was this program in United States, not so much in Canada, but it was called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO. And it was basically a surveillance program designed to keep surveillance on the Black Panther movement and the American Indian movement. because the American Indian movement were also considered unfriendly and terrorist. So they had to, anytime AIM came into the city, they had to have any of their meetings surreptitiously. They had to do it where they couldn't be found, and they didn't want anyone to know. So Harry said that we could use his apartment. So he let us use his apartment. He's got a great big place, great big brownstone in mid Manhattan. So that's where we went, and there was enough room there for about 30, 40 of us, and we all sat around and discussed. We went there because one of my friends, he was a grad student at Princeton, and he was one of the intellectuals for the American Indian movement. So he was the one that did a lot of the thinking for the AIM people, AIM strategizing. So John Trudeau was always one of these guys who said, you got to take the intellectuals and you got to put them on the front lines of the front trenches of any altercation, confrontation, conflict with the white man, with the predator, he called them. And so I remember John getting into a lot of discussions with a lot of people, because a lot of people were saying, no, you got to protect the intellectuals, you got to protect the elders, you can't let them we can't jeopardize any of them. So I remember that's when I met John. And then I didn't get to meet John again until 1977, when the International Indian Treaty Council was sending a delegation of representatives to go over to Geneva, Switzerland, to represent them at the United Nations. And John was there at the Standing Rock conference that was held by the International Indian Treaty Council. So I got to know John Trudeau a little bit, and then we brought him to Princeton as one of our speakers, and because I met him in 1974, so he came and he spoke. But the thing was that he, after the longest walk in 1977, after the longest walk, he burned an American flag on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And that was sacrilegious to the Americans. And then we found out that we couldn't prove this, but the FBI burned his home on the Santee Sioux Reservation in Nebraska. That his mother-in-law was in there, his wife was in there, and 4 kids. His whole family was burned alive, just destroyed. So he went through hell. Like the grief that he carried around was just insurmountable. And so a lot of people came to him to try to help him. In fact, one of the people that really came along and helped him was Jackson Browne. Jackson Browne really became good friends with him and got him. He says, you know, your poetry is so beautiful that we can put your poetry to music. And so that's when John Trudeau began his music career. It's a spoken word music that he was producing, and he had a traditional singer called Quilt Man. As Mary Lou said, he sings traditional music, and he sings with it. So the hand drum singer and John Trudeau with his poetry, they were a great act. They went everywhere. They produced about 14 CDs, and they were just great. And they would always breaks to Indigenous audiences, and so they went everywhere. They traveled to way up north, northern Canada. They went to all these isolated places. But anyways, I was so happy to see John Trudeau coming to launch a CD at the Aboriginal Voices Music Festival down at Harbourfront, and it was so great to hear the drum group Asayenes doing a sound check and doing the sound check with the song Strong Woman Song. And that's how that all came to be. And Quilt Man, who never does interviews, John Trudeau told me, well, Quilt doesn't do interviews. I says, okay, well, that's fine. But I said to myself, I'll ask him. I'll see if he's interested in doing one, because he seems like a friendly guy. And he said, sure. So we're sitting there, and that's all of a sudden, he just freaked out when he heard Asayenes singing the Strong Woman Song, his owl song. So that's a kind of a neat story about the origin of the Strong Woman Song. Now, women's drum groups all across Canada are still singing it as the Strong Woman Song. And I bet you a lot of them don't even know that the original the origin of that comes from the people from Oregon, people from Northern California, who call it the owl dance, the owl song. So that's a little bit of trivia history for you. Okay, Dave.
That's great. Thank you.
Next question.
I'm not seeing more questions from the audience or online. Is Galahindi there close by?
Yes, he is.
Yeah, I think he might have had more questions. Maybe he can turn the camera.
Okay.
Because we got.
Did you have more questions?
Does anyone here have any questions?
While we're at it, could we turn the camera a little?
You did ask some great questions earlier.
Towards Dan, because we got a shot of Mary Lou and the woodpile. If the camera could just shift a little bit towards Dan, because we've only got half of Dan.
He said, turn the wood. You're getting a good picture of me in the woodpile, but only a little bit of Dan.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, Pauline was asking about the prefix ab to the word Aboriginal.
Oh yeah, that's better.
And a lot of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, like right now, all the universities are changing over from Aboriginal, and they're changing over to Indigenous. Like at Public Western, they changed last year, and this year, what they used to call the Aboriginal Student Services is now called the Indigenous Student Services, where Vivian used to work. And so everything's changing right across the country, but it's just sweeping across because ab, it takes away from the original people. You know, we are the original people, and just that prefix makes it sound contrary to who we are. We are the original people, but Aboriginal makes it sound not the original people. So that's why they didn't want that term used to describe us. Yeah. Yes.
Same concept.
Yeah. Now there it's a little different because the Aboriginal people down there are black. Okay, so when that was another reason why Aboriginal, or that's what Indigenous people, they didn't want to be referred to as Aboriginal because the Aboriginals of Australia were pretty much black people. And even though, even though they don't, a lot of them don't look black, you know, they look like you and I, you know, but so there was an objection raised about calling themselves Aboriginal because they don't want to be mixed with the Aboriginals of Australia because they're not black. You know, we are, even though we have a lot of our people who are mixed, you know, like the Ramapo Lenape. You know, they're a good example of people. The Seminole people are, I mean, the Seminole people are black Indigenous people.
Can you repeat the questions from off camera because we can't hear them?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Biracial. Okay. Our one participant was asking the question when I was making note. He was observing that in a interracial couple, where the father was Indigenous and the mother was non-Indigenous, that the child from that relationship, from that union, was racial. So that was another term that has been incubated because of the coupling of two different nations. So I had a conversation with this elder from the Mi'kmaq, Mike. Do you remember his name from Mike from Asayenes? No.
Yeah, I know.
He was the MC for the powwow. Mike. Anyways, he said you can have 1/64th indigenous blood, and you can call yourself indigenous, and you can be welcomed into any indigenous ceremony. You have a right to be there just because you have your 1/64th indigenous. So, and that's the way most of our people are. We're very welcoming. If you say you're indigenous, then we're going to welcome you into our ceremony as an indigenous person. Mind you, you can still honor the other third 64th that you are of other nations, and that's fine to honor those other nations that the DNA that you carry. There's no problem with that. But we've always said that a lot of our people think that because they have such minimal amount of indigenous DNA, that they're not native, you know, and that they don't qualify, and that they're not going to be welcomed by our people when we have our feasts or we have our social dancing or our powwows. But that's not true. As Mike Doucette, an elder from Asayenes, Mi'kmaq, he said that no matter how much indigenous DNA you have, you are still indigenous, and you are still part of this land. And the land is what determines who you are. Not the what do they call that? Blood quantum, not blood quantum, but the land. So we have to start thinking like that. We have to start thinking in terms of you know, the original way that we used to think. You know, not this negative learned kind of behavior or education that's been brought here. Because a lot of that's colonial. That compromises our thinking, and it colonizes our thinking. So, go ahead, Dave. That was just an observation from one of our participants here.
That's great. Our online participants are down to just a couple people, and they haven't typed any more questions in.
Oh, okay.
So if you have any concluding words, or if Galahindi or you or Mary Lou wants to wrap up.
Well, I was just talking to Chief Mark Peters here, and I was talking to him about some of the questionable practices that have been visited upon indigenous peoples, and he was telling me about this these what would they call them? Land purchases? What kind of purchases?
Land transactions.
Land transactions. Why don't you tell him about how that worked?
Let's see, Mark. So can you shift in a bit closer to you?
Okay.
Yeah, that's good, Mark. Yep.
What was the question?
Oh, there's no question.
Oh,
It's just
okay.
We're just going to educate.
All right. Well, Dan and I were talking about what's known as the walking purchase.
Yeah.
It's a land fraud that was perpetrated on the Munsees in the 1740s, and it was supposed to be measured by the amount of land that a man could cover in a walk in a day's journey. And the Munsee perception of this, I guess, is that a person would take a leisurely walk through the woods, maybe stop, do some fishing, some hunting, have something to eat, and then complete their journey. But the English land speculators, actually the Penn brothers, the sons of William Penn, decided to make a trail in the woods first, hire 3 physically fit men who were good at running, and other little things they did to allow these 3 men to run through the woods for great distances and take in probably 4 times more land than we originally thought they would be able to obtain in a day's walk. So this is an example, I guess, of how we perceived the measurement would take place and how planned and fraudulent it really came to be. This land fraud was actually compensated for to the Delawares in the United States in the 1970s. However, us in Canada, being part of the United States, were not able to take part in that compensation.
And I'd just like to add further to that, Dave and audience. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about the term Indian summer.
Okay, we talked a bit about that, but you might be better
Oh, okay. Yeah.
explaining it.
Okay, I'm going by a historian by the name of Robert Venables from Cornell University. He's retired today, but he wrote about how the term Indian summer came to be. Now, the Dutch had settled pretty much Manhattan, and that's why it was called New Amsterdam. And they had certain ways of keeping the Lenape people away. And one of them was the term for Wall Street, and how the term Wall Street came to be, and how they used a head for like a kicking bowling ball. And that's kind of a genocidal history.
That's regarding what they call the massacre in Pavonia. That part of Manhattan Island was originally called Pavonia, actually. And as I mentioned, there was a massacre that took place there of the Wakwasgiks. And after the massacre, the bodies were mutilated and treated horribly. And I don't like to get into the details of this, but the fact is, apparently heads were cut off and used as soccer balls in the streets of Broadway and
Wall Street.
area. And I guess made an example of to the local native people that, you know, this is what's going to happen to you if you go against us. It was a new way of doing things for us. We weren't used to that type of thing happening, that type of death, massacre, the treatment of bodies after death. That was something very new and sent a shockwave, I think, through the entire area of Lenapehoking, of all the Munsees in that area, and would have impacts for years to come.
Yeah. And I was just talking about how when the Dutch were kept pushing using this walking purchase kind of deal, kept pushing the Lenape people back further and further west, so that they could settle the land east and set up their their villages and such. Well, one of the things they did was they would maintain a good defensive line of defense, so that the Lenape couldn't come back and attack them. So they had this forceful defensive armed defensive line, and then they would, as soon as the wintertime came, they figured, okay, well, that wintertime's here, so it's time now for us to retreat, go back to New Amsterdam, go back to home, and settle in for the winter, because we don't have to worry about the Lenape come back and attack us. So let's just go home. So they would do that. Well, the Lenape knew that the weather would drop all this snow, be cold for a little while, but they also knew that it would melt, and there would come a time when it would become almost summer-like, the conditions. They knew that, because it's a rhythm to nature. And so as a result, they would get themselves armed, and they would go and attack the Dutch, and they would push the Dutch back further, surprise them, and push them back east towards the ocean and reclaim some of their land. And so as a result, the Dutch called that Indian summer, because the Lenape were being so, I guess you could say, they were being so savage-like or warrior-like or so terrible to use the weather to trick them into thinking that it was wintertime, and then they would attack them and take their land back. Those, I guess you could almost call them Indian givers, eh? Yeah, there's yeah, there is.
Sayings and perceptions that come from this time period for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
The word law comes from this time period and this people. It was square. KWE was a respected, proud
Term, yeah.
word to be called, but it was derogated over time and has become a horrible thing to say now. Something that was common and like I say, respectful at one time.
Yes.
And these are the abuses that our language and ways have suffered as well.
Yeah, it became a very pejorative term. In fact, so pejorative that we wouldn't even, indigenous people wouldn't even use it, because we didn't want to shame our women. When this term actually was such a beautiful term when we used it to describe our women or speak to our women. And so we've never ever been able to reclaim that word. There was an anthropologist, Margaret Bruchac, who comes from the northeastern United States. She's an anthropologist who's done really great work in this area. But she tried to reclaim it probably about 2009, 10, 11. And she tried to lead a movement of reclamation to try to change and reclaim the word and try to change the word back to one of honor and respect and love that it was originally intended to be. And she got death threats from her own people. From her own people. I interviewed her a couple times because I thought that what she was doing was very brave. But she said that when she got those death threats, she thought, Jesus, it's not safe. It's not safe. We have become so colonized that we use that term in a pejorative way ourselves. And there's no way, unless we start to change it, turn it around, and start reclaiming the word and using it in a good way, will we start doing that and respect our women again. It's slowly happening. It's slowly happening that we are starting to treat our women with greater regard and greater respect. But it's been a long time coming. So that's a good example of how a word has been turned around. Yeah, I think we're stirring up the thunders up here.
Tapataqui. That's Munsee for thunder.
Oh, okay.
Tapataqui.
Tapataqui is they're sounding. They're letting us know they're around. Not in a bad way. You know?
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but the winds are coming. Grandfather's breath is here. So it's starting to happen, nice and cooling off period. And then it will get all calm, and then next thing we know, the deluge will arrive. Well, Mark, it's been great having you here. I think it's been your contribution, your teaching. I've been enjoying the well, I call them podcasts, but I've been enjoying them. I say Mary Lou, come listen to Mark. But Mary Lou's always got projects on the go. Sometimes she comes in and sits down and listens to you. But I really liked what you say, especially about New Amsterdam, etc. Okay, bye-bye.
that's good. I appreciate that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great.
That's,
You never know. You never know who's listening.
You never know who's listening, and those links stick around, and people can listen to them later. So we can get.
our members, but it's good to have other people listening in too.
Yeah, 'cause
Yeah.
then they know.
And we're getting a miigwech. Thank you for the teachings from our online audience. So
They need to
we
know
can
the
share these links to Mark's
truth. It has to be
podcast as
out
well.
there all over.
Okay.
But I
Anyway,
think the weather's going to turn. Maybe it's a good time to get all the electronics safe
Yep.
indoors.
Okay.
Well, Andy's been great connecting us like this.
Yep.
So any parting words for the folks before we go?
La Piche Canal, David. That's in, Mark. That's in Mark.
Bye, everybody. See you all later.
Yep. Bama Pi Kwabman, Onagiwa He, Nagiwa. Chimigwech, Yahweh.
Miigwech, thank you everyone for being with us. This has been Kensington.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?